The DC universe should have been inevitable. Not just successful, inevitable. You're talking about characters like Batman, Superman, Wonder Woman, names that have defined pop culture for nearly a century. And at the exact same time, the superhero genre was exploding, thanks to Marvel Studios. They didn't just succeed, they built a system, a machine. A cinematic universe that printed money, built long-term audience investment, and turned even B-list characters into household names. So logically, DC should have been right there beside them, a rivalry for the ages. Instead, it became one of the most confusing, inconsistent, and ultimately failed franchise attempts in modern Hollywood. And the worst part? They had the blueprint. They just refused to follow it. Our story starts with Man of Steel. After the massive success of the Dark Knight trilogy, Warner Brothers made a critical assumption. That tone was the key to success. So they brought in Christopher Nolan as a producer, hoping to replicate that grounded, realistic style. Then they hired Zack Snyder, a director known for bold visuals, slow-motion spectacle, and darker reinterpretations we had come to expect from his comic adaptations like 300 and Watchmen. And on paper, that combination sounds powerful. But here's the problem. Batman works in darkness. Superman doesn't. Superman is supposed to represent hope and moral certainty. Instead, Man of Steel presents him as conflicted, distant, and emotionally restrained. Even visually, the film feels muted with its washed-out colors, heavy destruction, and somber tone. And while Henry Cavill absolutely looked the part and carried himself with presence, the writing didn't give him a Superman to play. It gave him an interpretation that prioritized being modern and serious over being true to the character. And that decision would define everything that followed. Because instead of building a Superman, people could emotionally connect to, they built one people debated. Then came the moment that, in hindsight, sealed the DCU's fate. Batman v Superman: Dawn of Justice. This should have been DC's endgame-level payoff, a collision of icons, a story built on years of character development and ideological conflict. Instead, it was their second movie. Second, this is where Warner Brothers made their biggest mistake. They skipped the foundation. Compare that to Iron Man leading into the Avengers. Marvel took their time. They let audiences understand Tony Stark, meet Captain America, learn the world, build emotional investment, and DC did the opposite. Batman v Superman tries to introduce a new Batman, continue Superman's arc, set up Wonder Woman, introduce Lex Luthor, tease the Justice League, adapt the Death of Superman storyline with Doomsday, all in one film. It's overloaded. But more importantly, it's unearned. The conflict between Batman and Superman should be ideological, philosophical, and deeply personal. Instead, it feels manufactured, rushed, and because of that, the emotional payoff simply doesn't land. It's not just a misstep, it's a structural failure. Then Warner Brothers panicked, and you can see that panic all over Suicide Squad. At the time, Guardians of the Galaxy had proven that audiences loved silly, unconventional teams with strong soundtracks. So, what did DC do? They tried to replicate that formula. Fast. Way too fast. The result is a film that feels like it was edited by committee with its jarring tone shifts and disjointed pacing. Characters introduced through flashy montages rather than meaningful development. And then there's Jared Leto's Joker. After Heath Ledger delivered one of the most iconic performances in film history, this version felt like a complete setback, feeling more like a gangster rap version of Marilyn Manson than an ominous agent of chaos. And once again, the larger universe doesn't move forward in any meaningful way. No clear direction, no cohesive plan, just wasted potential. Then, something unexpected happened. After a criminally long wait for a Wonder Woman movie, it finally arrived, and it actually worked. Directed by Patty Jenkins, it focused on one character, one journey. Diana wasn't trying to be reinvented. She was simply allowed to be who she is, strong, compassionate, idealistic, and audiences responded to that. More than that, Patty made Diana a genuine role model for little girls, something that had been missing on that scale for far too long. It wasn't overly cynical. It wasn't trying to chase trends. It just told a story, which makes what happened next even more frustrating. Then came Justice League, a film that was supposed to change everything. This was meant to be DC's answer to the Avengers, the culmination of years of setup, the payoff audiences had been waiting for, all the major heroes finally united on screen in a defining cinematic moment. Instead, it became something else entirely. Behind the scenes, Justice League unraveled into a well-documented production disaster. After Zack Snyder stepped away from the project, Joss Whedon was brought in to fix the film. What followed stands as one of the clearest examples of heavy studio interference in modern blockbuster filmmaking. Whedon's mandate was clear: reshape the film into something more in line with Marvel's proven formula, lighter, faster, and filled with more humor. But the foundation of the film was still Snyder's. The result is a Frankenstein mess, two distinct creative visions stitched together into a single body that never fully comes to life. In one half leans dark and operatic, the other bright and quippy, and instead of complementing each other, they clash at nearly every turn. The result isn't a foundation, it's a shortcut. What audiences got was a film where the characters simply weren't established well enough for their relationships to matter. Key heroes are introduced and brought together so quickly that there's little time to understand who they are, let alone why they should care about each other. Because of that, the emotional core never takes hold. Moments that are meant to feel meaningful, team unity, sacrifice, camaraderie fall flat because the groundwork just isn't there. The film asks the audience to invest in relationships it hasn't taken the time to build, and without that foundation, it never feels like the cinematic event it was meant to be. This was supposed to be DC's defining moment. Instead, it confirmed what many audiences were already feeling. This universe wasn't working. And yet, for a moment, things briefly improved. In the aftermath of Justice League, DC pivoted. If not with a clear plan, then at least with a willingness to experiment. Aquaman leaned fully into spectacle. It embraced color, scale, and expansive world-building, delivering something grand and visually distinct. In many ways, it felt closer to an underwater version of Thor. Then Shazam went in the opposite direction entirely. Shazam was smaller, lighter, and more personal. It focused on character, humor, and heart, echoing the tone of films like Ant-Man or Spider-Man: Homecoming. At this point, Warner Brothers pivoted again. Following the success of Wonder Woman, the studio leaned harder into female-led projects, an effort some saw as an attempt to reshape the brand into a DCU, with films like Birds of Prey and Wonder Woman 1984 leading the charge. But instead of building on what worked, the execution shifted. Wonder Woman 1984 took a different tonal and thematic approach that many saw as a misguided attempt at broader political messaging, while Birds of Prey leaned heavily into a girl power identity, but struggled to find its audience. And once again, the inconsistency caught up with them. In one of the most surprising moves in modern blockbuster filmmaking, Batgirl, a nearly completed film was shelved following the Warner Brothers Discovery merger. A decision like that is almost unheard of, and it reinforced a growing perception among audiences. This studio doesn't have confidence in its own product. Then, during the lockdowns, the studio released Zack Snyder's Justice League, a 4-hour alternate version that reignited fan debate. Was Snyder's vision better? Should it have been continued? These questions dominated discussions, but they existed alongside an even more telling trend. At the same time, completely separate DC films were succeeding: Joker and Matt Reeves' The Batman. These films shared a few key traits: clear direction, a strong creative identity, and no connection to the broader cinematic universe. Ironically, that independence is exactly why they worked. From a brand perspective, however, the contrast was stark. DC now looked fragmented, disconnected. Multiple competing visions operated under a single label, each pulling in a different direction, and the audience was left to navigate the chaos. Then came Black Adam, starring Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, who openly talked about reshaping the DC hierarchy. There were promises: a long-term vision, the return of Superman, and a major showdown that could redefine the universe. For a brief moment, when Henry Cavill did return, fans allowed themselves to hope. But it didn't last. Once again, leadership changed, plans shifted, and the carefully teased setup was reset. Just like that, everything started over. By the time the remaining slate of DC films rolled out, it hardly mattered anymore. Shazam: Fury of the Gods, The Flash, Blue Beetle, Aquaman, and The Lost Kingdom, each release was tainted not just by the failing universe, but by multiple scandals surrounding their lead actors. They weren't being judged on their own merits. They were measured against a universe audiences had already stopped believing in, and against the distractions of abusive talents and negative press. Without that investment or trust, even decent ideas couldn't land. They simply fell flat. Now, James Gunn is in charge. For the first time, DC has something it has long lacked: a central creative voice, a structured plan, something closer to what Kevin Feige built at Marvel. Based on his past work, including the Suicide Squad, Gunn clearly understands character-driven storytelling. But there's a huge problem now: trust. Audiences have been reset too many times. They've invested, only to see that investment deleted more than once. Convincing people to care again is as much a challenge as building a coherent universe. Complicating matters further, Warner Brothers is now part of Paramount, adding another layer of uncertainty. Even Gunn, who has been the guiding hand DC desperately needed, may not stay long under this new corporate structure. And so far, reception to Gunn's extended universe has been mild at best. Evidence that even with a clear vision, DC still struggles to recapture the excitement and confidence audiences once had. The challenge isn't just creating a universe, it's convincing audiences that this one will actually last. Because when you strip everything down, the DCU didn't fail because of bad characters or even bad actors. It failed because of instability, impatience, and inconsistency. No long-term commitment. Every problem sparked a pivot. Every failure triggered a reset. Every trend was chased instead of taking the time to design and establish their own brand. Over time, that eroded the one thing a cinematic universe depends on: trust. This should have been Marvel's greatest rival. Instead, it became one of the clearest examples of how not to build a franchise, and for that reason, will forever be Warner Brothers' greatest failure. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more deep dives into movies and cinematic universes.